June 7, 1944, dawn, Normandy. The earth shudders as waves of M4 Sherman tanks emerge from the morning mist. Their engines hum like an industrial storm rising from the sea. Dust and shattered hedgerow leaves cling to their green steel. Each turret swivels like a clock hand marking the next hour of battle. Across the fields, buried in smoke and disrupted wheat, German Panzer crews wait. They are veterans of Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, men raised in the gospel of breakthrough. Warfare, the Panzer doctrine, is their language, their rhythm, and until now this language has answered every challenge. But something is different. The sound is not of a few enemy tanks, but of hundreds, a rolling tide of armored craft. Charging through the bocage in numbers the Wehrmacht has never faced, the sky is filled with the drone of Allied fighter-bombers. Every hedgerow hides a gun, every hill hides an enemy. A new kind of war has arrived. The Panzer divisions, once unstoppable, have finally met their match, not in a superior tank, but in a swarm. The German Panzer divisions did not begin as symbols of unstoppable force. They were born as a calculated gamble, a synthesis of military innovation, industrial capacity, and strategic desperation. In the aftermath of World War I, bound by the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was restricted in its ability to develop tanks, yet beneath the surface planning continued, quietly, methodically. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Germany's newly formed Reichswehr began studying how to use mobility and shock to overcome larger armies. Men like Heinz Guderian, a former signal officer and early armored warfare theorist, believed tanks were not just another support weapon. They were the key to breaking modern warfare wide open. Guderian famously wrote, "If tanks succeed, then victory follows." By 1935, Hitler cast away treaty restrictions. The Wehrmacht was born, and with it the Panzer divisions. These were not just armored units, they were self-contained, mechanized battle groups, tanks, artillery, engineers, infantry, all moving under a unified command, supported by radio coordination, and backed by dive bombers like the Ju-87 Stuka. The world first saw what they could do in September 1939. Poland fell in just over 5 weeks. German panzer battalions crossed rivers, encircled Polish counterattacks, and shattered resistance before it could become coherent. It was not the tanks alone that won. Many were light models like the Panzer I and II. It was how they were used. Fast, coordinated, ruthlessly efficient. Then came 1940, France. The French and British armies possessed comparable tank numbers. Some French models had thicker armor and larger guns, but German armored doctrine, centered on speed and concentration of force, eclipsed them. The breakthrough at Sedan created chaos. Within days, panzers sliced through France like a blade, severing Allied command and control. Dunkirk became the only escape. German newspaper reels showed panzers moving with almost mechanical precision. Technicians measured their distance traveled in kilometers per day, not meters per hour. The myth of blitzkrieg was born, and soon believed even by the Germans themselves. But blitzkrieg was never a specific doctrine. The term was a media invention. The reality was more complex, a coordinated interplay of maneuver warfare, radio communication, and tactical aggression carried out by well-trained officers and men drilled to embrace initiative. It relied on the Panzer as the spearhead, but demanded every other branch of the army to keep up. By 1941, as the panzers rolled into the Soviet Union, Germany controlled more of Europe than Napoleon ever had. The 3rd, 4th, and 7th Panzer Divisions carved enormous strides into Soviet territory. Kiev fell, Smolensk, Panzers reached the gates of Moscow before winter stopped them. But even then, cracks were forming. German tank production was not keeping pace with losses. Panzer IVs and III variants dominated the early years, but many had thin armor and underpowered guns compared to what would emerge. When the Soviet T appeared in battle, it shocked German crews with its sloped armor, wide tracks, and reliable gun. The Wehrmacht adapted, upgrading Panzer IVs, creating new models, and pushing for heavier tanks like the Panther and Tiger. Yet they never had enough. German factories operated under constant resource strain. Their logistics lines were stretched thousands of kilometers. The very principle of blitzkrieg, rapid movement, had extended too far. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the war, something was quietly taking shape across the Atlantic. A tank that would not be the fastest, or the thickest, or the most powerful, but it would be there, everywhere. And in numbers the Panzer divisions could scarcely imagine. While German industry strained to replace every tank lost on the Eastern Front, the United States was preparing for a very different kind of war, one fought not only by soldiers and machines, but by factories, assembly lines, and logistics networks on a scale the world had never witnessed. In 1940, before America had even entered the war, U.S. Army planners were already studying reports from Europe. They saw the speed of German armored divisions. They saw the consequences of poor coordination between infantry and armor. They saw how France, with its scattered tank units, had been decisively broken by a concentrated armored thrust. The U.S. drew a single conclusion. If America entered the war, it would need a tank that could be produced rapidly, repaired easily, shipped anywhere, and fielded in overwhelming numbers. Not the best tank, the most available tank. The first answer was the M3 Lee and Grant, a stopgap design. Its odd multi-level gun arrangement made it ineffective in tight terrain, but it proved one thing: American industry could build tanks quickly and ship them even faster. By 1941, the next step was underway: the M4 Sherman. It was designed with a clear philosophy: mass, reliability, and logistical simplicity would win wars more effectively than complexity and limited production. Its 75 gun was adequate for most battlefield targets. Its armor was moderate, its speed was solid, but its greatest advantage lay beneath its armor: a mechanical system that could be maintained with basic tools and repaired quickly under fire. Where Germany engineered specialized machines with unique parts, the United States standardized nearly everything. Engine types varied, but components were simplified, interchangeable, and easy to replace. A damaged Sherman could be repaired in hours. Destroyed one could be replaced by another fresh from a ship. Then production began, and the numbers changed the shape of the war. In 1942 alone, the United States produced more tanks than Germany and Italy combined. By 1944, America was producing Shermans in quantities Germany could not hope to match. More than 49,000 Shermans would be built by the war's end. The sheer volume ensured that every Allied army, American, British, Canadian, Free French, Polish, could field armored forces large enough to sustain losses and keep advancing. Allied commanders understood the battlefield reality. The Sherman did not need to be superior to German Panthers or Tigers in a one-to-one fight. That was never its role. Instead, it was built to work as part of a system: infantry support, artillery coordination, naval gun support, and overwhelming air superiority. By 1943, Shermans were in North Africa facing the Afrika Korps. There, they encountered the Panzer III and IV, and the battles were far more equal than German propaganda later suggested. In open desert fighting with good crews and coordination, the Sherman held its own. Its stabilized gun, allowing firing while moving, gave it an advantage German tanks lacked. And, more importantly, replacements arrived continuously. A regiment that lost 5 Shermans in a morning could receive 5 new ones within days. Germany could not match this. As the Allies prepared for a return to Western Europe, the Sherman became the centerpiece of the invasion plan. Every beachhead, every armored column, every advance inland depended on it. Tank transport ships were loaded by the hundreds, maintenance teams trained by the tens of thousands. The Allied war machine was not simply producing tanks. It was producing an armored ecosystem, global supply networks, repair depots, recovery vehicles, fuel trains, and replacement crews. By the spring of 1944, Germany's Panzer divisions, reduced by years of attrition and starved of fuel and spare parts, were bracing for an invasion. Their tanks were powerful, their crews were experienced, their doctrine was lethal. But they were outnumbered before the first shot was fired. As June approached, one truth became clear. The war that had once been defined by German initiative was about to be reshaped by Allied quantity. And when the landings began, the Panzer divisions would discover what it meant to face not a handful of enemy tanks, but a relentless swarm. The men inside the tanks defined the war more than the steel that surrounded them. German Panzer crews saw themselves as elite. They were highly trained, often led by experienced NCOs and steeped in a culture of tactical initiative. Many were veterans of campaigns that had ended in victory: France, the Balkans, early Russia. Their training emphasized rapid decision-making, precision, and the belief that they were the cutting edge of a new form of warfare. Panzer crews often operated with a level of camaraderie and autonomy rare in other armed forces. From loader to commander, every man knew he was part of a weapon, a moving spear, not just metal and gears. On the other side of the battlefield, many American Sherman crews were recent recruits. Some had trained for late-war tank battles, but had never seen a real enemy before Normandy. Their tanks were faster to build than the training pipelines required to field them. As a result, many crewmen learned combat the hard way, under fire. And yet the Americans brought something crucial into battle: adaptability. They were burdened by rigid doctrinal expectations. They learned from the field. Crews often improvised, adding improvised armor like sandbags or spare tracks, adjusting tactics between hedgerows, and coordinating with infantry more flexibly than early German formations. In the end, neither side won or lost by machines alone. Tanks don't fight, tankers do. German military leadership prized Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. It was a principle rooted in 19th century Prussian planning. Give subordinate leaders a clear objective, but allow them full freedom in execution. Panzer officers were expected to show initiative. Tank commanders broke formation when needed, adjusted positions on the fly, exploited weaknesses quickly. This allowed German armor to move with speed and fluidity in early campaigns. But Auftragstaktik required experience. It required fuel, communications, and confidence in the chain of command. By 1944, many of those pillars were eroding. Panzer divisions often lacked replacement officers. Fuel shortages meant movement was limited. Allied air superiority shattered supply lines and command posts. Tactical freedom is worthless if you cannot move. American doctrine was almost the mirror opposite. U.S. leadership believed in overwhelming force applied consistently. Shermans were never meant to fight alone. They moved as part of combined arms teams: infantry, artillery, engineers, and aircraft working in concert. The U.S. Army didn't rely on the brilliance of individual officers. It relied on a system of standardized procedures, logistics, and communications. Some German commanders sneered at this approach. It seemed mechanical, predictable, but it scaled across battalions, across continents. Even when individual crews and platoons were knocked out, the system held. Where German armored leadership shined in short thrusts and local brilliance, American leadership succeeded by ensuring one thing: there was always another Sherman. In 1940, morale in the Panzer divisions was nearly unbreakable. Unit histories speak of armor crews laughing in their photos after crossing the Meuse, smiles under steel helmets, confident. Commanders standing in open hatches. They believed they were invincible, and for a time they were right. But by 1944, German morale had shifted. On the Eastern Front, tank crews burned alive inside. Tigers struck by Soviet AT guns. Towards Normandy, many Panzer crews were redeployed. Without rest, racing across France as Allied ships and aircraft filled the skies. Crews sometimes faced enemy armor before their own tanks could even be refueled. Sherman crews, by contrast, often came ashore with mixed emotions: fear, excitement, uncertainty. But where the Germans felt the weight of decline, Americans felt momentum. Word spread quickly: "There are thousands more behind us," one Sherman gunner wrote home. They knew the odds of surviving a tank tour were slim. A direct hit could ignite ammunition or tear the turret apart, but they also knew their replacements were never far away. For the Panzer crews, every mechanical breakdown, every lost tank, every dead comrade was a permanent loss. For the Americans, every loss was tragic but not final. Morale is not just belief in victory, it is belief in continuity. And by 1944, only one side could claim continuity on the battlefield. German armored tactics relied on precision, a well-coordinated dance of tanks, infantry, and close air support, all striking a single point in the enemy's line. The Panzer division was not meant to grind slowly forward. It was designed to pierce the enemy, to create rupture, shock, and collapse. German tanks often moved in wedge formations, with Panthers or Panzer IVs at the front and lighter vehicles flanking. Anti-tank guns followed closely, forming layered protection around the spearhead. In 1940, this worked brilliantly. French defenses were overwhelmed in days. In Russia and Tyre, Soviet armies were swallowed by encirclements. Blitzkrieg became legend. But against the Shermans, especially in Normandy, the Panzers found themselves fighting a different war. No single thrust would shatter the Allied line. Hedgerows broke the battlefield into countless enclosed fields where large armored maneuvers were impossible. Infantry ambushes, artillery, and airstrikes constantly disrupted German movements. Meanwhile, American tactics relied on methodical pressure. Shermans advanced behind artillery barrages and infantry cover. They exploited open flanks, not by speed, but by supporting units as they crawled forward. When a unit was repulsed, they did not pause to reorganize. Another battalion simply moved in behind it, supported by overwhelming artillery fire. German units were shocked by this approach. One former Panzer commander recalled, "We destroyed the first wave, then the second came, then the third. By the fourth we had no ammunition left." German tactics depended on decisive, localized breakthroughs. American tactics depended on exhaustion of the enemy's fuel, manpower, and will. On paper, German tanks like the Panther and Tiger outclassed the Sherman in almost every category. The Tiger I's 88mm gun could knock out a Sherman at over 2,000 meters. Its frontal armor was nearly invulnerable to the Sherman's 75mm rounds at typical battlefield ranges. The Panther's sloped frontal armor and high-velocity 75mm gun made it one of the most lethal tanks of the war, a deadly predator on the open plains of Eastern Europe. But technology is not measured by numbers alone. The Tiger weighed 54 tons. It consumed fuel at a rate Germany could not sustain. Breakdowns were frequent. Panther transmissions snapped under stress. Recovery vehicles struggled to move. Disabled German tanks under fire. Spare parts were scarce. A single breakdown could knock an entire platoon out of action for days. The Sherman, in contrast, was almost brutally simple. Its vertical volute suspension was rugged and reliable. Its engines, whether gasoline or diesel, could be replaced in the field. Parts were interchangeable across variants. Crews could replace a transmission with basic tools in a few hours. Its weight allowed it to cross weaker bridges and move faster through broken terrain. It wasn't just a tank. It was a tool designed for global warfare. And while the German guns were lethal, the U.S. Army found solutions. The British added the 17-pounder to create the Firefly. The U.S. fielded 76 Shermans with better armor penetration, M10 tank destroyers, M36s with 90 guns, and devastating Allied close air support made up the difference. A single Sherman rarely beat a Tiger. But battlefields aren't duels. 5 Shermans moved faster, shot more often, and called in artillery. The German tank crew never fought just the tank in front of them. They fought an entire system. War is not won by the best equipment. It is won by the best sustained equipment. German armored formations entered Normandy with insufficient fuel, inadequate spare parts, and tanks that required constant maintenance. Panther engines often failed even before reaching the battlefield. Tigers had to be transported by rail, and the moment they unloaded, Allied aircraft hunted them mercilessly. Every kilometer needed fuel trucks, every breakdown needed rare spare parts, every crew replacement required specialization Germany no longer had. American logistics officers understood this. They didn't just plan battles, they planned shipping timetables, fuel depot locations, and frontline repair schedules months in advance. The U.S. established repair depots on the beaches of Normandy within days of the landing. Wrecked Shermans were hauled back, stripped for parts, and returned to the front. A single armored division received hundreds of tanks over the course of the Normandy campaign, not through heroics but through paperwork, unloading cranes, and industrial muscle. Germany lost tanks it could not replace. America lost tanks it did replace, faster than the enemy could destroy them. In war, numbers are not just statistics, they are momentum. The Panzer division still had discipline, skill, and experience. But by 1944, they were no longer fighting an enemy army. They were fighting a war machine. The German Panzer divisions arrived in Normandy knowing they faced a foe unlike any before. But they did not yet understand what made this enemy different. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as Allied troops stormed the beaches, German armored reserves prepared to counterattack. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and Panzer Lehr Division were among the best in the German arsenal, well-equipped, battle-hardened, and led by officers who believed the invasion could be thrown back. At first, they struck hard. On June 13, 1944, at the village of Villers-Bocage, German ace Michael Wittmann and his Tiger tank tore into a British armored column of Cromwells and Fireflies. Within minutes, more than a dozen Allied vehicles lay burning. It was a glimpse of what German armor could still do in the right environment, under ideal conditions. But Villers-Bocage was an exception, not the rule. By mid-June, the fighting had shifted into the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy. Here, panzer divisions faced an entirely new problem. They could no longer use maneuver to compensate for being outnumbered. Every field was a fortress, every advance bottlenecked into narrow lanes. Tanks advanced 50 meters at a time, with infantry feeling their way through dense growth, under constant threat of ambush. And the Shermans kept coming. One German officer described it simply: every time we destroyed one, two more appeared on the ridge. Panzer Lehr, one of the best-trained divisions in the Wehrmacht, entered Normandy with nearly 100 tanks and assault guns. By July, after weeks of non-stop combat and constant air attack, fewer than 40 remained. What killed them was not just the Sherman, it was the system behind it: the endless supply of artillery, the constant arrival of replacement vehicles, and above all, the Allied air forces that turned daylight into death. On June 25th, Operation Epsom began. British and Canadian forces launched a massive push toward Caen, supported by more than 600 tanks. Panzers counterattacked with skill and fury. German Panther tanks chewed through the leading British armor, but the Allied infantry dug in. Fresh Shermans rolled forward behind barrages of artillery. Every German advance was caught under a carpet of 25-pounder shells and mortar fire. Again and again, the Panzer divisions lashed out, counterattacked, and were driven back by sheer weight. Then came Operation Cobra, July 25, 1944, the breakout. Engineers paved special tank routes through the hedgerows. Thousands of U.S. bombers dropped more than 4,000 tons of explosives on German defenses, and behind that shockwave came the tanks. Hundreds of Shermans crossed the St. Lo Perriers Road in a single afternoon. Panzer Lehr division, already battered, was annihilated in a matter of hours. Its armored strength fell from over 90 tanks to fewer than 12 in 3 days. Panzer crews staggered from the smoke, stunned by what they had just faced: not superior machines, but an unbroken line of them. When German reinforcements arrived, they found not a battlefield of dueling tanks, but one of collapsed defensive lines, cut off infantry, and shattered command posts. The Shermans were no longer fighting the Panzers head-on. They were pushing through gaps, surrounding them, cutting them off. This was no longer blitzkrieg. This was overwhelming force destroying maneuver warfare itself. One field, one ridge, one crossroads at a time. By August, the German armored forces in Normandy were cornered in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. Hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles were abandoned or destroyed. Thousands of infantry were killed or captured. Once elite panzer divisions were reduced to small, fleeing remnants. The Germans had entered the campaign confident that their Tigers and Panthers could repel Allied armor. But tanks do not win wars in isolation. And in Normandy, the Panzers realized the truth: even the best armored weapon is helpless against a system designed to replace itself faster than it can be destroyed. The mythology of the Panzer divisions grew like wildfire in German military culture. They were not just armored units, they were avatars of Germany's new destiny, symbols of a nation reborn from humiliation. Blitzkrieg, with its dazzling successes, had become a doctrine wrapped in arrogance. The generals believed they had discovered the formula for modern victory. Yet beneath the victories lay a dangerous oversight: the belief in qualitative superiority, overwhelming quantitative reality. To the German high command, a single Tiger or Panther was worth 5 Shermans. A Koenigsteiger might as well have been 10, and in individual engagements, on a clean field with experienced crews, good maintenance, and abundant fuel, that math held some truth. But war, they forgot, is never waged on perfect terms. By 1944, many of Germany's best panzer crews were dead or exhausted. Replacement units lacked experience, Fuel was rationed, ammunition delayed, mechanical breakdowns often destroyed more Panthers than Allied shells did. Poor logistics led to tanks abandoned in forests because they couldn't move. The Germans had miscalculated twice. First, they believed technology alone would always compensate for numbers. Second, they assumed their enemies would never adapt, that the Soviets would always charge in waves, that the British would always defend, that the Americans with their inferior tanks would never master combined arms warfare. And so, in June 1944, when the Panzers thundered toward Normandy, many still believed that myth. They charged with confidence, but soon found themselves hemmed in by airstrikes, swarmed by swarms of Shermans, bombarded by artillery, and outmaneuvered by infantry with bazookas. This was the first clue that the myth and the doctrine beneath it was cracking. The United States did not build the Sherman to be a dueling machine. They didn't even try. The American military-industrial engine was not obsessed with creating the best tank. It was obsessed with producing enough tanks, parts, fuel, and trained crews to win a total war on two continents. The M4 Sherman was born of this philosophy. It was fast to build, easy to transport, simple to maintain, and designed to work with other units, not stand alone as an invincible titan. While the Panzer divisions relied on perfect conditions, the Sherman relied on flexibility. Where a Tiger needed specialized fuel and bespoke parts, a Sherman could be fixed by a field mechanic with a wrench and some spare track links. One could be knocked out by a Panzer, but within hours, another could replace it. The Americans fought like the industrial power they were, disruption-resistant, relentless, decentralized, and endlessly supplied. The Germans sneered. The Shermans burned like candles. But what they failed to understand was this: it doesn't matter if you destroy 5 candles when the enemy has an infinite box of matches. Moreover, the Americans did not fight Shermans against Tigers alone. They fought with artillery, naval gunfire, engineering tanks, infantry with bazookas, and the sky filled with P-47 thunderbolts. The Sherman was just one part of a storm. It wasn't superior, it was sufficient, and sufficient scaled up became unstoppable. While German engineers obsessed over the perfect tank, American factories churned out Shermans by the thousands. Every tank rolled off the assembly line faster than the Wehrmacht could replace one destroyed Panther or Tiger. By mid-1944, the United States was producing more than 1,200 tanks per month, with output only accelerating as new plants came online. This numerical advantage translated directly to battlefield dominance. German tank commanders could destroy 5 or 10 Shermans in a day, but within days, those numbers were replaced, reinforced, and supported by additional infantry and artillery. In effect, the Allies could absorb losses that would have been catastrophic in 1940 or 1941. The assembly lines were more than production sites. They were an industrial weapon. Every component was standardized: engines, tracks, guns, and transmissions designed for interchangeability. Spare parts could be sent across the Atlantic, shipped to Normandy beaches, and installed within hours. A damaged Sherman rarely meant a permanent loss. It simply returned to the queue for repair or replacement. The Germans faced a cruel arithmetic. Quality could not overcome quantity indefinitely. Every Tiger knocked out meant the Allies could advance with another 10 Shermans. Every destroyed Panzer was a blow to morale, logistics, and the finite German supply chain. By the time American and British armored units swarmed into the hedgerows of Normandy, the balance of power had shifted. Numbers alone do not win battles, but in combination with coordination, logistics, and supporting arms, they create momentum. And in the summer of 1944, momentum became a weapon the Panzer divisions could no longer counter. The M4 Sherman was never designed to outgun a Panther or a Tiger in a direct duel. Its 75 gun was often ineffective against thick German frontal armor, and its armor could be penetrated by nearly every German anti-tank weapon. On paper, the Panzer was superior, heavier, deadlier, and seemingly invincible. Yet battlefield performance is never dictated by specifications alone. The Sherman's advantages lay in mobility, reliability, and adaptability. Its vertical volute suspension allowed it to cross terrain many German tanks struggled with. Its lighter weight meant fewer mechanical failures and a lower logistical burden. A Panther stranded in mud or missing a track could be a lost tank. For days, a Sherman could keep moving with minor damage. Tactically, the Sherman thrived in combined arms operations, unlike the isolated duels envisioned by German doctrine. Shermans advanced alongside infantry, artillery, and close air support. Engineer tanks cleared obstacles, flamethrower variants neutralized bunkers, and coordinated attacks allowed weaker Shermans to punch above their individual weight. The Germans initially underestimated this integration. They were trained to rely on speed, shock, and concentrated firepower. In hedgerow country, with Shermans advancing methodically behind artillery barrages, Panzer doctrine faltered. Tigers and Panthers could destroy one Sherman, but could not halt a constant stream of replacements backed by air supremacy. Technology alone did not decide the battle, it was the system in which it operated. German tanks were technically superior in isolation. American tanks were operationally superior in context. By the time the Panzer divisions realized that no single weapon could dominate, they were already being encircled, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered across the Normandy countryside. The Sherman was not the end of German armor. It was the beginning of a strategic collapse. The Panzer divisions could no longer resist. By late July 1944, the fighting in Normandy had entered a new, decisive phase. German Panzer divisions, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg, were now forced into defensive positions across the Bocage, a labyrinth of hedgerows, narrow lanes, and fields. The terrain neutralized many of their advantages: speed, coordination, and massed firepower. A single Tiger could dominate a lane, but it could not cover every flank, every crossroads, or every hidden approach. On July 25th, Operation Cobra began. The U.S. First Army, under General Omar Bradley, unleashed a massive aerial and artillery bombardment on the German defenses near St. Lo. Over 4,000 tons of bombs fell across a narrow front, leveling hedgerows, roads, and German positions. When the smoke cleared, the first waves of Shermans advanced methodically and relentlessly, supported by engineers clearing obstacles and infantry securing flanks. German Panzer units, including remnants of Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Hitlerjugend divisions, counterattacked immediately. Tigers and Panthers opened fire, knocking out a dozen Shermans in minutes. Michael Whitman, the famous Tiger ace, led one such assault, destroying several American tanks, but the German response, no matter how skillful, was limited. Every destroyed Sherman was replaced within hours by fresh vehicles from supply depots, while artillery and air support decimated German reinforcements before they could arrive. By July 27th, the breakthrough widened. Shermans poured through gaps, encircling German units in smaller pockets. Where Panzer divisions had relied on concentration and initiative, they now faced sheer, overwhelming numbers. In the confined bocage, tactical skill alone could not counter relentless attrition. Shermans pressed forward, backed by a system of logistics, infantry, and artillery, eroding German defensive cohesion. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Panzer Lehr, considered one of Germany's elite divisions, entered the campaign with roughly 100 armored vehicles. By the end of the Cobra offensive, fewer than 40 remained operational. Casualties among crews and supporting infantry were devastating. Command structures fragmented as radios failed and officers were killed or captured. The myth of Panzer invincibility, honed in Poland, France, and early Russia, was shattered not by superior firepower, but by the relentless weight of the Allied armored system. Elsewhere, the Falaise Pocket was forming. German armored units attempted to retreat northeast, hoping to regroup, but the Americans and Canadians had closed in, aided by the continuous flow of Shermans that allowed them to maintain pressure without pause. Tigers and Panthers, capable of annihilating Shermans one-on-one, could not halt a tide of tanks moving in concert with infantry and artillery. It became clear that the battlefield had fundamentally changed. The Panzer divisions, once masters of rapid maneuver and shock tactics, were now fighting a war of endurance, one in which numbers, supply, and coordination outweighed individual excellence. By the end of August, nearly all German armored forces in Normandy had been destroyed, captured, or forced into disorganized retreat. The U.S. and Allied forces had achieved a decisive breakthrough, and the stage was set for the liberation of Paris and the advance into Germany itself. The turning point was not the destruction of a single Tiger, nor a heroic stand by a single Panzer crew. It was the relentless application of industrial power, tactical integration, and numerical superiority. The Sherman, once underestimated, had proven that endurance, coordination, and supply could outmatch technological excellence and battlefield skill. The Panzer divisions, feared and revered across Europe, had met their match. By early August 1944, the German Panzer divisions in Normandy faced a reality that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. What had once been a symbol of unstoppable offensive power was now trapped, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. The Falaise Pocket, stretching from Chambois to Trun, became a crucible where the fate of the German armored army was decided. The encirclement was not an accident. Allied commanders, learning from months of reconnaissance and attrition, coordinated forces with precision. Sherman units advanced in waves, supported by artillery, engineers, and infantry. Air supremacy allowed P-47 Thunderbolts to strike at supply lines, roads, and retreating columns. Every attempt by German armor to break through was met not by a single counterforce, but by a cascading system of firepower. Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, among the most elite German units, found themselves cornered. Tigers and Panthers fired with devastating effect in isolated engagements, destroying Shermans at ranges and rates that would have been decisive elsewhere. But each loss was temporary. Reinforcements arrived, fresh Shermans took their place, and the advancing Allied infantry closed the net. German tanks that ran out of fuel or were immobilized by terrain could not be recovered in time. Recovery vehicles were destroyed, roads were blocked, and air attacks prevented resupply. In the chaos, German morale collapsed. Commanders attempted desperate counterattacks, but coordination had broken down. Panzer units that had once moved with precision now became fragmented. Tanks were abandoned, crews were captured or killed, supply chains were severed. Histories record hundreds of German tanks left burning in fields, a testament to both tactical brilliance and the impossibility of sustaining it against industrial-scale warfare. By August 21, the pocket was effectively closed. Estimates suggest that over 50,000 German troops were captured and hundreds of armored vehicles destroyed. Units that had once advanced across Europe with confidence were reduced to scattered remnants fleeing eastward. The Sherman had proven its decisive role, not through singular superiority, but through the weight of numbers, reliability, and integration within a broader combined arms system. The destruction of the Panzer divisions in Normandy sent a clear message to the German high command. Tactical skill and superior technology were insufficient against an opponent who could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. The battlefield no longer favored initiative alone, it favored momentum, endurance, and systems thinking. The war that had once been dominated by the fearsome speed and precision of German armor had been fundamentally transformed by the relentless tide of Shermans. From Villers Bocage to Saint-Lô, from the hedgerows to the Falaise cliffs, the clash of doctrines reached its apex. The Panzer divisions, once celebrated as invincible spearheads of blitzkrieg, had met the Sherman swarm, and the results reshaped the path of World War II in Western Europe. The collapse of the Panzer divisions in Normandy had immediate and profound effects on the battlefield. German armored units once feared across Europe were shattered in a matter of weeks. Elite divisions like Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Hitlerjugend had been reduced from operational strength of nearly 100 tanks each to mere remnants. Infantry units were cut off, supply lines severed, and defensive positions abandoned under relentless pressure. The German military had lost both material and momentum. For the Allies, the operational gains were staggering. The destruction of German armor opened corridors across the Bocage, allowing infantry, artillery, and mechanized units to advance. Without the constant threat of concentrated armored counterattacks, the Saint-Lô Falaise corridor became a gateway for the liberation of northern France. By August 19, Allied forces were racing toward Paris, the German army in chaotic retreat. The once feared Panzer divisions had been neutralized not by technological failure alone, but by the combined power of numbers, coordination, and logistics. Casualty reports underscore the scale of the collapse. German losses in tanks and armored vehicles during the Normandy campaign exceeded 1,000 units destroyed, damaged, or abandoned, with thousands of men killed, captured, or wounded. American and British forces, while sustaining their own losses, were able to replace destroyed Shermans quickly, maintaining an uninterrupted advance. The operational balance of power had shifted decisively. Strategically, the aftermath demonstrated the limits of German armored doctrine. Blitzkrieg, once the paradigm of modern warfare, could no longer rely solely on speed, shock, and initiative. Fuel shortages, logistical strain, and attrition meant that even elite formations could not recover from sustained pressure. Meanwhile, the Sherman, as part of a system of combined arms and industrial scale, proved that quantity, reliability, and support could overcome the tactical superiority of an elite enemy. The psychological impact was equally significant. German troops who survived the Falaise pocket were demoralized, recognizing that their skill and training could not overcome the relentless tide of Shermans. For Allied forces, morale soared. The previously abstract promise of numerical superiority and industrial might have been proven on the battlefield. Officers and enlisted men alike gained confidence in the systems that sustained their operations, reinforcing doctrine and coordination in the subsequent push across France and into Germany. In short, the immediate consequences of the Sherman swarm were not just material. They reshaped battlefield strategy, undermined German doctrine, and established a template for industrial-scale warfare that would dominate the Western Front for the remainder of the conflict. The destruction of the Panzer divisions in Normandy reverberated far beyond the hedgerows of France. Strategically, Germany's ability to mount a coherent armored counterattack in Western Europe was effectively nullified. Once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, the Panzers had been reduced to fragmented units incapable of massed operations. The remaining armored formations were confined to defensive, reactive roles, often deployed piecemeal in desperate attempts to slow the Allied advance. Allied planners capitalized on this vacuum immediately. The collapse of German armored power allowed forces to exploit breakthroughs and pursue retreating units across northern France. Paris fell on August 25, 1944, marking not just a symbolic victory but a clear demonstration of how industrial superiority and logistical coordination could transform operational success into strategic dominance. Sherman's, constantly reinforced and maintained, were instrumental in sustaining the momentum of this advance. The implications for German military strategy were profound. The myth of Panzer invincibility, carefully cultivated through years of victories in Poland, France, and early Russia, was shattered. German officers now faced a stark reality. Even elite tanks and skilled crews could not overcome an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. This forced a shift in priorities, with Hitler and the High Command emphasizing static defenses, fortifications, and the development of heavier, more complex tanks, measures that were expensive, time-consuming, and ill-suited for the fast-paced mobile warfare the Panzers had once mastered. For the Allies, Normandy validated the principles of mass production and combined arms integration. The Sherman became a symbol not of technological dominance, but of systemic efficiency. Its success demonstrated that a tank need not outgun every opponent to achieve strategic results. Reliability, replaceability, and coordination could achieve the same objective. On a continental scale, the battle also highlighted the decisive role of logistics, air superiority, and operational planning in modern warfare, lessons that would inform campaigns across Europe and the Pacific. Morally and psychologically, the collapse of German armored formations eroded the confidence of both troops and commanders. German soldiers recognized that tactical skill could no longer guarantee survival. Meanwhile, Allied forces drew confidence from their ability to sustain losses while maintaining pressure, reinforcing the belief that industrial and operational depth could be a decisive weapon in itself. In the long term, the Normandy campaign foreshadowed the nature of late World War II armored warfare. Dominance would belong not to the most technologically sophisticated units, but to those who could combine reliability, production, and coordination into an unstoppable system. The Sherman, once dismissed as a mediocre tank, had become the instrument by which the Panzer Division's aura of invincibility was finally broken. The encounter between the Panzer Divisions and the Sherman swarm is more than a story of tanks, tactics, or numbers. It is a lesson in the evolving nature of warfare, where human skill, technological sophistication, and industrial power intersect. The Panzers had once embodied the apex of armored warfare: speed, precision, and deadly efficiency. Yet in Normandy, these qualities met a new reality, a system designed to endure, replace, and overwhelm. The Sherman, modest in armor and firepower compared to its German counterparts, became a weapon not by individual superiority, but by integration into a larger mechanism of war. It reminds us that battles are rarely won by the brilliance of a few, but by the coordination of many. The unseen support, the endless flow of supplies, and the adaptability of men under fire. 1. Tiger could kill 10 Shermans, but the system did not rely on one. It relied on thousands. There is a deeper human element here as well. German crews fought with courage and ingenuity, honed through campaigns across Europe and Russia. American crews, often inexperienced, learned quickly under fire, improvising, supporting one another, and trusting in a process larger than themselves. The clash was not just steel on steel, but the collision of philosophies, the individual's skill against the collective's endurance. Strategically, Normandy became a turning point. The myth of Panzer invincibility ended not with a single heroic strike, but through relentless pressure applied by numbers, coordination, and logistical mastery. The Sherman swarm transformed the battlefield, demonstrating that industrial capacity and systems thinking could redefine what it meant to win a war. In the end, the lesson echoes beyond tanks and hedgerows. Success in complex endeavors, military, technological, or societal, often depends less on perfection and more on reliability, adaptability, and scale. The Panzer divisions had been unmatched until they met a force that could absorb, endure, and persist. History remembers not just the tanks, but the system that made the Sherman swarm unstoppable, forever reshaping the art and science of modern warfare.